Season 1, Episode 7, The Liverpool and Manchester Railway Part 2, Try Again. Over the last 3 episodes, we've been looking at the early days of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. In episodes 4 and 5, we talked about the Rainhill trials, and in the last episode, we looked at the LNMR's struggles to overcome the opposition to their line and get an Act approved. We saw how the merchants of the two towns felt that improving the connections between them was essential to trade, how a railway had been considered several times, and that William James had finally kick-started the group that formed the basis of the line that eventually became successful, before he got kicked out and replaced by George Stephenson. And then we looked at the amazing efforts of Stephenson and his team to complete the survey against all odds, and how it all fell apart at the last minute in the Parliamentary Committee when George blew it. OK, that's a bit unfair, but it's kind of the gist. And Parliament rejected the bill. Today, I'll share how the LNMR clawed its way back from the rejection of that bill and finally got approval, and how along the way it devoured its children. Well, perhaps not its children, but a couple of its engineers. But before we get started, we need to answer our last trivia question. On the last episode I asked, who was appointed in 1837 as the Great Western Railway's first locomotive superintendent? The answer was Daniel Gooch. For the first couple of years of the GWR, Brunel designed the engines himself, but none of them were particularly successful, and in 1837 he appointed Daniel Gooch as locomotive superintendent. Amazingly, Gooch was just 21. He'd hold the role of locomotive superintendent for the next 27 years and remain a key part of the GWR until he died. OK, on with the show. So, at the end of the last episode, we left the Liverpool and Manchester Railway dead on the floor of Parliament. The bill was roundly rejected, and the opposition councils had used every chance they got to lay the blame on George Stephenson's plans and to attack his personal credibility. Often, when you're reading historical insults, you have to read between the polite lines. The British in particular are masters of the backhanded compliment, and in the past, when there was more of an emphasis on outward etiquette, that was even more true. Not in the parliamentary hearing on the LNMR's first bill, though. There, subtlety was not the order of the day. Some of their choice slaps had included, "It was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard stated by any man. I am astonished that any man standing in that box would make such a statement without shrinking to nothing." Whatever credit you might have been disposed to give to Mr. Stephenson before, it is plainly shown now how utterly and totally devoid he is of common science. He makes schemes without seeing the difficulties, and when the difficulties are pointed out, then he starts other schemes. He is either ignorant or something else which I will not mention. These are the official minutes, remember, not some tabloid coverage. You could forgive the LNMR's committee members, they still weren't directors since they didn't have a legal company to be directors of, for being dazed and needing time to regroup. But if they were, they didn't need long. Just 3 days after the decision, before they'd even left London, the committee held a meeting with a group of MPs and lords they thought were likely to be friendly, and agreed that the failure of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Bill during the present session does not appear to this meeting an event which ought to discourage the subscribers from renewing their application the next session of Parliament. They might be down, but they weren't out. But what was to be done about their engineer? Well, that wasn't such good news. Given George's poor performance and the kicking that he'd taken, the committee reached the decision that they needed to replace him and redo the survey. In the words of Henry Booth, "On the 1st of July, it was resolved that Mr. John Rennie be requested to undertake the office of engineer to the company. After some correspondence, it was agreed that Messrs. George and John Rennie should be the engineers of the railway, and Mr. George Rennie, pursuant to instructions, undertook a new survey of the country between Liverpool and Manchester in order to report to the committee the best line for a railway." To their credit, some of the individual committee members remained supporters of George generally, if not going so far as to actually help him keep his job. One of them wrote to him comfortingly, "I assure you, I regret the loss of the railroad bill as much on your account as for the mortification we all feel. No one can be more satisfied than I am that you deserved very different treatment than you met with from Mr. Alderson." That was the opposition counsel. "Your talents are of much more valuable nature than that of a witness in the House of Commons." But still, the decision had been made. Like William James before him, George was out. And this time, the Rennies were in. So who were the Rennies? George and John Rennie had an illustrious engineering pedigree. Their father, also called John, had founded a civil engineering practice focused on canals, bridges and docks. By the time of his death in 1821, it was one of the most respected in Britain. Before he died, one of his designs had been selected for a new London bridge, and so John the Younger took over the work. They were fully paid up members of the establishment. When the bridge was completed in 1831, John would be knighted for his work. So in mid-1825, when the LNMR committee wanted recognised engineers to help them get a second bill through Parliament, the foundation stone for that new London bridge had just been laid. There weren't many better names to have associated with their line than the Rennies. By the way, if you want to see Rennie's Bridge, it's still standing, but it's going to be a hell of a trip if you're in old London town. In 1968, it was sold to the American Robert McCulloch and shipped to the city he was building in Arizona. In fact, while I'm digressing, the new bridge has another curious connection to our story. McCulloch wanted the bridge to be a tourist attraction. The one problem was that the peninsula he was building his new city on had no river for it to cross. So he reassembled London Bridge on land at the neck of the peninsula, and when it was standing, he had the land beneath it dredged to form a canal. I know what you're thinking, only in America. Which is all fascinating, but what's the connection to our story? Well, McCulloch's new canal needed a name, and since this was the first canal in the area, why not call it after the first canal in Britain? So today, Old London Bridge crosses the Bridgewater Channel, named for the canal that the Liverpool and Manchester directors were planning to compete with. Anyway, back to 1825 and the LNMR line. Although it was the Rennies' name that would carry the weight, they brought on another engineer to actually do the survey. Charles Blacker Vignoles. If you're thinking you've heard that name before, then congratulations, you must be paying attention. I told you to remember his name back in episode 5. When I mentioned him then by name, I described him as a strong supporter of Braithwaite and Ericsson, the team who entered Novelty to the Rainhill trials. But Vignoles got a sneaky second reference without being named when I told you about a reporter for Mechanics magazine who was biased against George Stephenson. That reporter was Charles Vignoles, and today we'll find out why he was so biased. But before we do, let's get a bit of background on Vignoles. He'd had what could only be called a colourful start to life. He was born in Ireland in 1793 to a British Army officer. During this time, Britain was at war with revolutionary France, and within the year his father was shipped off to Guadeloupe, taking his wife and infant son with him. 2 months after the British attack on the island began, Charles's parents were taken prisoner and died of yellow fever. Charles was just 1 and was now an orphan, stranded 4,000 miles from home. A Frenchman took care of the boy until his uncle could arrive, at which point the story gets weirder. 18-month-old Charles was made an officer in the army. Apparently this wasn't that unusual at the time. It was a way to give dependents a pension and didn't come with any actual expectations of service, as his confirmation letter proves in what I can only hope is a great example of British dry wit. The Commander-in-Chief, General Sir Charles Grey, has appointed your nephew Vignoles an ensign in the 43rd Regiment. He shall exchange to half pay immediately, as he is too young to serve. He was 18 months old. Anyway, after his dramatic infancy, his uncle brought him back to Britain, and he was raised in London by his grandfather, a professor of mathematics. He qualified in the law, served in the army in the Netherlands and France in the French Revolutionary Wars, yes, they were still going on, and then spent 6 years in America, where he acted as a city surveyor. Coming back to Britain in 1823, he struggled to make ends meet, and was forced to rely on the generosity of an aunt. It looks like family connections helped him find work as well. Through 1824, he was doing various survey works on canals and docks for James Walker, the engineer who would later compare both locos and stationary engines for the LNMR. And in July 1825, he joins back to our main narrative when he was asked by the Rennies to carry out their resurvey of the Liverpool and Manchester line. Both George and John Rennie each seem to have spent some time surveying the line with Vignoles, but for the most part, the detailed work was left to him. Henry Booth again. The committee, on the recommendation of the engineers, determined to adopt a new line of way, passing considerably to the south of the former route. In furtherance of this resolution, Mr. Charles Vignoles, on behalf of Messrs. Rennie, was appointed to prepare the necessary sections and plans of the projected undertaking. Vignoles worked feverishly to come up with a new line that would avoid as much of the controversy as possible. His new line avoided both the Earl of Sefton's property and the Leeds and Liverpool Canal altogether. It entered Liverpool via a tunnel, didn't go into Manchester at all, and didn't cross the Irwell. Vignoles and the committee even solved their problem of the opposition from the Bridgewater party by using what today might be considered questionable tactics. To start with, Vignoles obviously decided to handle Robert Bradshaw more gently than Stephenson had, and it worked. Around this time, Bradshaw wrote to a colleague, "The Manchester and Liverpool railroaders are certainly going to Parliament again next session. Their existing surveyor has just been here to show me their new plans, etc., and ask permission to go over our lands, to which, you will scarcely believe it, I have consented. But the man behaved so fairly and openly that I really could not refuse. Am I not a Liberal?" When Bradshaw had opposed the first bill, the committee had tried approaching him to take a stake in the project, but he'd refused. Now, according to the biography of Vignoles, his son wrote, George Rennie and Vignoles used their better relationship with Bradshaw to raise the idea again. This time, though, Bradshaw had a counter-proposal. He proposed that the Bridgewater Trust become the sole owner of the railway. And to show that however liberal he may have become, he still had some teeth, he followed it up with a scarcely veiled threat. The alternative was to be uncompromising opposition, and the agent had not the least doubt as to the Duke coming off conqueror in the contest between him and the railway company, should war be declared between them. But the committee outplayed the old Bridgewater agent. They went round him to the Marquis of Stafford himself, the man who, as we saw in the last episode, received the income from the Bridgewater Trust, and they sold him, the Marquis, 1,000 shares at face value. That represented an investment of £100,000, or about £9 million in today's money, was a fifth of the investment in the line at the time. Which is interesting enough on the surface. Here was the beneficial owner of the Bridgewater Canal investing in the newfangled opposition to it. But perhaps the most missing interesting part is given by an aside in the Journal of Mrs. Arbuthnot. If you wanted to buy shares in the line at this point, and you weren't the Marquis of Stafford, you'd have had to pay twice the face value. So basically, this amounted to a giant kickback to quiet the opposition. But whatever you think of the morality of the thing, it worked. Of course, there were different standards in the corporate world in 1825 than there are today, and the soon-to-be directors certainly didn't see anything wrong with it. They list the Marquis's shareholding in the next prospectus as a good thing, and Henry Booth wrote about it in his account. So, that was the Bridgewater opposition well and truly neutralised. As I explained in episode 6, the Marquis didn't have any actual voting rights in the running of the trust, but Bradshaw was hardly likely to act directly against his interests. So, on the 26th of December 1825, 6 months after their previous failure, the committee issued a new prospectus. The goal was obviously to reassure the investing public that they had addressed all of the earlier objections, and as a result it contained one last kick in the pants for George Stephenson. A very prominent objection taken by the opponents of the bill was founded on the errors in the section and levels as exhibited before Parliament. These errors the committee at once acknowledged and regretted, and to avoid all chance of similar complaint in future, they have engaged the professional services of most eminent engineers, aided by assistants of undoubted talents and activity, whose combined efforts justify the fullest assurance, not only of the correctness of the plans and sections, but that the whole line will be laid down and arranged with that skill and conformity with the rules of mechanical science. Ouch. But if George was upset by this latest jibe, then things would be looking up for him soon enough. In February 1826, the new bill was submitted to Parliament. As well as the changes to the route, the committee's new bill avoided the challenges over locomotives that George Stephenson had been subjected to, by the simple approach of not asking for the right to use them, and making it clear that if they ever did in the future, then they'd submit to any conditions Parliament wanted to put on them. This wasn't such a big compromise as it might seem to us today. As we've seen in previous episodes, not all of the directors were convinced locos were the right answer anyway, and even though some of them, like Henry Booth, were still in favour of locomotives, without George Stephenson involved, there wasn't anyone prepared to push as passionately for them. Charles Vignoles and George Rennie presented the plans to Parliament, and by all accounts acquitted themselves extremely well, or at least much better than their predecessor. On the 6th of April, the bill was supported 88 to 41 in the House of Commons and moved to the House of Lords, where they got their first indication that they weren't going to get a completely free ride. In the December prospectus, the committee had said, "They are happy to be able to state that they can no longer find an opponent in Lord Sefton, and with reference to the Earl of Derby, they conceive they are entitled to apply the same observation." On the 10th of April, Lord Derby proved their conception wrong. He stood and declared that he would oppose the bill in the committee, and true to his word, he did. But it made little impact. The bill's supporters had lobbied effectively, and this time their witnesses didn't give the opposing counsel any opportunity to find fault with their plans. On the 1st of May, the bill was voted on by 32 Lords, and the result could hardly have been better for the railway. Only 2 Lords opposed it, Lord Derby, predictably, and Lord Wilton. Wilton was actually a member of another branch of the huge Egerton family that produced the Duke of Bridgewater, but given that the Duke's heir was now on side, we can be pretty sure that wasn't what was driving his decision. We don't have a statement from Wilton explaining his vote, but I feel fairly confident the answer will become clear once I tell you that Lord Wilton was Lord Derby's son-in-law. In any case, Derby and Wilton aside, the bill had passed. 4 years after William James had proposed it to Joseph Sanders, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway had received royal assent, and the committee could finally call themselves the directors of a railway line. Now all they had to do was build it. And to build it, of course, they needed to officially appoint an engineer to the new company, and as Henry Booth said, it was obvious that in an undertaking of such magnitude, a resident engineer of experience and ability was indispensable, and the directors naturally turned their attention to Mr. Stephenson of Newcastle, a gentleman thoroughly acquainted with practical mechanics and possessing more experience in the construction and working of railways than perhaps any other individual. Picture George Stephenson picking himself up off the mat. Sorry, couldn't help that. It wasn't quite that simple though. The directors, or most of them at least, wanted to have their engineering cake and eat it. They wanted George back, but they didn't want to lose the benefit of the association with the Rennies that they knew had helped get their bill passed. So they came up with a compromise plan. Have George Rennie as supervising engineer and George Stephenson as a resident operative engineer with Vignoles and others working beneath him. The Rennies weren't so keen on that idea. According to Booth's published accounts, Mr. Rennie proposed to the directors that the resident engineer should be of his own appointing. But that was the version designed for public consumption. The truth is that Rennie gave the directors an ultimatum. According to the minutes of the board meeting, Rennie said that he would not object to Mr. Jessup, Mr. Telford, or any member of the Society of Engineers being consulted, but he would not be associated in any way with Rastrick or Stephenson. There's no obvious explanation here other than that the Rennies were being snobs, and they got what they deserved. Again, in Booth's words, on the 19th of June, the directors took Mr. Rennie's proposition into consideration. They would have been glad of the professional assistance of Mr. Rennie, but it was their duty to take advantage of the best practical knowledge within their reach. Mr. Rennie's proposition was respectfully declined, and Mr. George Stephenson was elected principal engineer to the company. See, that would be another of those polite-on-the-surface insults I said 19th century Englishmen specialised in. If you just look at the story of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in isolation, then the directors' decision to take Stephenson back after his disastrous performance in Parliament and to snub the Rennies who'd succeeded where he'd failed might seem a bit odd. But of course, parliamentary performance wasn't the only piece of information the directors had. It wasn't even the most recent. And the important thing to notice is how many times Booth refers to experience and the practical nature of what they needed. They were making their decision in June 1826. Stephenson's car crash at Parliament was a full year earlier, but as we saw in episode 3, between those two dates there had been a pretty significant development in the history of the railways. The Stockton and Darlington Railway had opened with great fanfare. And who had been front and centre in all of that fanfare? George Stephenson. Not only had he built the line, he had personally driven the locomotive that pulled the inaugural train on the opening day. The Rennies, for all of their proud engineering pedigree, had nothing similar to show. If you wanted experience, if you wanted practical, your mind went to the bluff, capable northerner, not the cultured Rennies. So George agreed to act as engineer for £800 per year. And to put that in perspective, if you do a straightforward adjustment for inflation, then £800 would be worth between £60,000 and £70,000 now, which I think we can all agree is a nice enough salary. But money's a complicated thing, and that probably understates what a big deal £800 was at the time. If you use what economists call relative income, that is, you compare the number of people earning £800 at that time to what other people were earning at the same time, well, then to get the same effect today, you'd need a salary of more like £1 million. Whatever measure you use, it was a huge amount of money. It's hardly any wonder that there's a fair degree of bitterness between the people vying for these jobs. And if you're getting the idea that that might have been what we storytellers call foreshadowing, then give yourself a pat on the back. You might well be onto something. You could be assuming that with the Rennies off the line, then Vignoles would have gone with them. But in fact, that wasn't the case. While it was understood that he was the Rennies' man, and more than that even, that they'd have appointed him as their lead engineer if they'd got the role they wanted, he was actually contracted directly to the L&MR. So, while they were gone, he was still employed on the line. And now he was expected to work under the man who he and his former patrons had already replaced once, who they'd refused to work with, and whose job he would have been doing. All of which left him in a rather uncomfortable position. Still, he hadn't personally offended Stevenson, so he must have thought that he could manage it. So when the two men met at Liverpool, where Vignoles was already at work staking out the line and beginning the draining of Chat Moss, Vignoles took the normal 19th century approach and gave the older man a letter of introduction from a common acquaintance. The idea was to get someone you both knew to write a bunch of nice things about you as a sort of recommendation. Unfortunately, in this case, it seems to have backfired. Vignoles would later write to the man who'd made the introduction. Soon after this, I delivered your letter, which, from Mr. S.'s subsequent expressions, I found gave him mortal offence, inasmuch as your friendly recommendations were construed by him as admitting me to be his partner instead of his assistant. So, not a great start. But there was work to be done, and neither man was the sort to sit idle. Over the next couple of months they were feverishly busy, but the cracks were already starting to show. They never established a good relationship, and it's clear that Vignoles felt the fault lay with Stevenson, as he later wrote to a different friend. I also acknowledge having on many occasions differed with him. I also plead guilty to having neglected to court Mr. S.'s favour by crying down all other engineers, especially those in London, for though I highly respect his great natural talents, I could not shut my eyes to certain deficiencies. All these circumstances combined gave rise to a feeling of ill will on his part towards me, which he displayed on every occasion. Despite this, they rubbed along for a couple of months, but in September, work began on the project that would break the fragile relationship between the two men for good: Edge Hill Tunnel. A month later, in October 1826, wanting more of his own men on the line, Stevenson brought Joseph Locke on board. Locke was the 20-year-old son of one of his old friends from his colliery days, and he had been serving as an apprentice to George since January. With another pair of trusted hands present, he was able to split responsibility for the line. He put Locke in charge of the eastern end, including the draining of Chat Moss that was still ongoing, and gave Vignoles responsibility for the west, including the Edge Hill Tunnel. The tunnel at Edge Hill is quite often listed as the first to be built under a city. It wasn't. In fact, down in the capital, Mark Brunel had been using his famous tunnelling shield on the Thames Tunnel for almost a year, and his son Isambard had been working on it with him since April 1826. And that wasn't the first one either. But Edge Hill was a colossal piece of work. We'll look at Edge Hill Tunnel in more detail in the next episode, when we look at some of the civil engineering works along the line. For today, it's enough to know that the tunnel wasn't built by starting at one end and digging all the way through. It would just take too long. Instead, the line was marked out on the surface, and a series of shafts were dug down to the depth of the future tunnel. Once the bottom of the shaft had reached the right depth, the miners would start tunnelling sideways until they met men coming in the opposite direction from other shafts. Obviously, that approach means you can start in several places and have multiple teams working at the same time. However, as I guess is equally obvious, it means you better be bloody sure that all of the separate teams are working on the right line. In November, George reported to the directors with some bad news. The pilot boring of the tunnel was 13 feet off course. If it had continued undiscovered, the sections wouldn't have joined, and at least one of them would have been technically illegal, as it would be outside the area permitted by the Act. And more than that, he said that because it was off track, it risked undermining the foundations of the houses above it. Time, money and effort had been wasted, and they put the lives of the people of Liverpool and the reputation of the company at risk. Naturally, as the supervising engineer, he took full responsibility and offered to fall on his sword as all good leaders would. Not really. He placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of the young engineer he'd put in charge of the tunnel, the holdover from the Rennies' time, Vignoles. And he said he had to go. It seems that some of the directors weren't convinced the younger man was the only one at fault, nor that the situation was as bad as George was telling them, and certainly not that the solution was for Vignoles to leave, but they weren't prepared to argue. So Vignoles went the way of the Rennies. Out. In the letter Vignoles wrote that I quoted from earlier, he also acknowledged that he'd made a mistake, but he's adamant that it was recoverable. The truth is, George wanted him gone, and this was the first excuse he'd had. I think Rolt's biography of George and Robert Stevenson sums it up quite neatly. He writes, "It is clear that Stevenson's sense of inferiority caused by his lack of formal education had been intensified to bitter resentment by the treatment he had received in London, and that he had stubbornly determined that no one remotely associated with those responsible for his humiliation should play any part in the Liverpool and Manchester project." But, just in case you're feeling too sorry for Vignoles, cast your mind back to episodes 4 and 5, and you'll remember that he hardly took it on the chin and behaved like an angel himself. When it came to the Rainhill trials 2.5 years later, which we covered in those episodes, he joined Braithwaite and Eriksson, and he didn't miss any opportunity to turn the knife on the man who'd thrown him out. And in case knifing him in the front wasn't enough, as far as we can tell, the unnamed source of almost all of the newspaper articles that we saw in those episodes, talking up Novelty and criticising Rocket, all of that "Novelty is the people's favourite" line, was written by Vignoles. What's more, he never let go of the animosity he felt. On the 10th of April 1827, about 6 weeks or so after he'd left the LNMR, Vignoles became a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers, the body who wouldn't admit George Stephenson. That doesn't necessarily indicate any grudge against his previous boss, of course. Joining the institution was a sensible step for a young man looking to make this a lifetime career. But what definitely does indicate his ability to hold a grudge longer than most was that 40 years later, when he was appointed president of that same institution, his inaugural speech included the line, "The Novelty was long remembered as the beau ideal of a locomotive, which, if it did not command success, deserved it." I don't know whether to be impressed or disappointed. 40 years, get over it, Charles. But anyway, back in 1827, with Vignoles gone, George made some more changes. He moved Locke to the Liverpool end of the line, promoted William Walcard to supervise the central section, and he brought in John Dixon, who, as we saw in episode 3, had worked for him on the Stockton and Darlington Railway, to replace Locke in the east. To quote Rolt again, George would show the world that he was fully capable of carrying it through without the aid of any smart, book-learned engineers from London, and to make sure that no one should take from him the smallest share of credit, he staffed the line with his own pupils. Luckily for George and the LMR directors, and I'd argue the wider history of the railways, those pupils would become some of the greatest railway engineers of the first half of the 19th century. And we're going to stop there today, poised in early 1827, with most of the work on the line just getting started in earnest, with George Stephenson in overall command of the line, surrounded by men he could rely on. In the next episode, we'll see how, despite none of them having any formal training, nor even much civil engineering experience to speak of at this point, he and his 3 resident engineers became responsible for some truly amazing civil engineering works, and made the line that would become famous as the world's first modern railway into a reality. But before we go, here's today's trivia question. When was the first underground public railway opened? Tune into the next episode in a fortnight for the answer. And if you can't wait that long, then check out historyoftherailways.com, where you'll find episode show notes and the answer to today's question. Finally, if you're enjoying the show, then can I ask you to do me a favour? Leave a review wherever you're listening. Good reviews mean that it'll get recommended to others, and as a new show, every one of them really counts. It'll only take a minute, and it really helps me out. Okay, that's it for today, so come and join me on the next episode as we look at what it took to build the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. If you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can find relevant images and links to the source material I used for research on historyoftherailways.com, where you'll also find ways to support the show. If you want to get in touch, then just drop me a line at michael@historyoftherailways.com or follow us on Facebook and join the conversation there. So tell your friends to come and join us on the next episode as we get distracted, fascinated and yes, even sidetracked by the stories from the history of the railways.